The air inside the television studio was cool, conditioned to perfection to keep the expensive equipment from overheating. But under the bright lights, it felt like an oven. The buzz of the audience was a low hum, a living thing that grew and shrank like the tide. They were excited, waiting for the show to start, shifting in their velvet seats and checking their phones. High above, the rigging held massive lights that blazed down onto the sleek, black floor of the set. It was a world of polished surfaces and high energy, a place where smiles were often painted on, and silence was the only thing that was never allowed. Backstage, behind a heavy curtain that blocked out the noise, Keanu Reeves sat in a canvas chair. He was not checking his phone. He was not looking at himself in the mirror. He was just sitting, his hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly. A woman with a makeup brush was dusting his face, trying to hide the signs of a long flight and a life lived without enough sleep. She was gentle, moving the soft bristles over his forehead. Keanu looked at her and gave a small, tired smile. He didn't need to say thank you, his eyes said it for him. He was there to talk about something serious, a foundation he had started to help children who were fighting cancer. It was a heavy topic, but he carried it lightly, as if he were just talking about friends he needed to help. On the other side of the curtain, the atmosphere was completely different. The guest waiting to go on with him was a former judge from a popular courtroom show. He was a man who was used to having the last word, a man who lived in the loud world of television where conflict was king. He was pacing back and forth, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. He laughed loudly with one of the producers, slapping him on the back, his voice booming. He seemed to feed on the energy of the room, growing larger and louder with every second. He wasn't thinking about sick children or quiet charity work. He was thinking about ratings. He was thinking about being the funniest, the smartest, the loudest voice in the room. A producer in a headset stuck her head between the curtains. 2 minutes, everyone, let's go. Keanu stood up. He smoothed down his jacket. He didn't look nervous, but there was a stillness about him, a calmness that felt out of place in the chaos of the studio. He walked toward the opening, his steps quiet. The judge was right behind him, practically bouncing on his heels, ready to perform. As they walked onto the set, the audience erupted in cheers. It was a wall of sound, clapping and shouting. Keanu raised a hand and gave a shy wave, keeping his head down slightly. The judge threw both arms up in the air, grinning from ear to ear, soaking in the applause like it was sunshine. He walked to his chair with a strut, sitting down and spreading his arms wide over the backrest, owning the space. The host of the show, a polished man with a perfect smile, waited for the noise to die down. "Welcome back to the show," he said into his microphone. "We have a very special show for you today. We have the one and only Keanu Reeves here with us." The audience clapped again. And sitting right next to him, the legendary television judge, Mr. Vance. The judge nodded at the camera, his face serious for a split second before breaking into a smirk. "Great to be here," he said, his voice deep and commanding. The interview started smoothly. The host turned to Keanu first. He spoke softly about the new project, explaining how the money raised would go directly to families who couldn't afford treatment. He talked about the bravery of the kids he had met. As he spoke, his voice got a little quieter, not out of fear, but out of respect. He wasn't acting. He wasn't playing a character. He was just a man telling the truth about a hard thing. The audience listened. Even the studio seemed to hold its breath. The occasional laughter from the crew stopped. For a moment, the flashy lights and the cameras didn't matter. It was real. But the judge didn't seem to like the quiet. He shifted in his chair. He looked at the host, then at the camera, then at Keanu. He tapped his finger on the table. The mood was too serious for him. It wasn't entertaining enough. He cleared his throat loudly, interrupting Keanu just as he was finishing a story about a young girl he had visited. "That is very noble, truly," the judge said, his voice cutting through the soft tone Keanu had set. "It is wonderful to see celebrities giving back, but you know, Keanu, you have this reputation. The internet loves you." Keanu turned to him, blinking slightly. "I'm lucky they enjoy the movies," he said humbly. "Oh, it's not just the movies," the judge pressed on, leaning forward. There was a glint in his eye now, the look of a hunter spotting prey. He decided to steer the ship into rougher waters. "It's the whole persona, the sad Keanu memes, the way you carry yourself. People find it fascinating. Here you are, One of the most successful actors in history, worth millions, and yet you always look like. Well, like you're waiting for a bus that isn't coming. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh people give when they aren't sure if they should be laughing. Keanu gave a small, awkward smile. He was used to this. He had heard it before. I guess I just take my time, Keanu said lightly, trying to deflect it. The judge, however, wasn't done. He smelled blood in the water. He wanted to show that he was the one in control, the one who could see through the Hollywood image. He wanted to prove he was the realist, the tough guy. He waved a hand dismissively. Come on now, the judge said, his voice dropping to a mock-serious tone that was meant to be funny. Look at you. You have the world at your feet. You can have anything you want. And yet you sit there with that face. Is it just an act? Do you think it makes you look deep? Is the melancholy part of the brand now? Do you think it sells more tickets if people feel sorry for you? The silence that followed was instant and heavy. It wasn't the respectful silence from when Keanu was talking about the sick children. This was a cold, uncomfortable silence. The audience stopped shifting. The smiles faded. Even the host looked stunned, his eyes widening as he glanced nervously at his producers off camera. The makeup artist backstage winced, pressing her hand to her mouth. Keanu didn't look down. He didn't look away. He sat very still, looking at the man next to him. The studio lights seemed to get hotter. The air felt thinner. The judge sat back, a satisfied smirk on his face, waiting for the laugh that never came. He thought he was being charming. He thought he was being the smartest man in the room. But looking around the studio, on the faces of the crew and the audience, it was clear that nobody else was laughing. He had crossed a line, turning a moment of genuine connection into a cheap punchline, and the whole world was watching to see what would happen next. The silence that filled the studio was heavy, like a thick blanket that had been thrown over a fire. It wasn't the kind of quiet that happens when people are listening intently. It was the kind of quiet that happens when someone says something terrible at a dinner party, and nobody knows what to do with their hands. The air conditioning seemed to hum louder than before. The cameras kept rolling, their red lights glowing like unblinking eyes, capturing every second of the discomfort. The judge sat with his arms still stretched out, his smile frozen on his face. He was waiting for the laughter to start. He was waiting for the audience to clap and agree with him. But the sound never came. In the rows of seats facing the stage, people looked at each other. A young woman near the front stopped chewing her gum, her eyes wide with disbelief. An older man in the second row shook his head slowly, a frown creasing his forehead. They knew Keanu's story. They knew about the losses he had suffered in his life, things that were not funny, things that were not brands. To hear a man in an expensive suit make a joke out of genuine pain felt wrong. It felt cruel. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from excitement to a tense, awkward vigil. On the stage, the host was sweating. He could feel the ratings slipping away, or worse, a scandal being born. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded fake even to his own ears. Okay, the host said quickly, tapping his papers on the desk. Mr. Vance here is certainly known for his tough questions. He doesn't pull any punches, does he? He looked at the judge, trying to give him a signal to stop, a look that said you've gone too far, pull back. But the judge missed it, or he didn't care. He was too proud of his own joke. He leaned back, crossing his legs, looking pleased with himself. I'm just saying, the judge continued, his voice booming again, oblivious to the mood in the room. We live in a world where everyone wants to be a victim. Everyone wants to be sad. But when you have everything, what is there to be sad about? It seems. Ungrateful. He waved his hand in the air again as if he was swatting away a fly. I think the audience agrees with me. Lighten up, Keanu. It's a beautiful day outside. Keanu hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the same position, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't look at the host. He didn't look at the audience. He was looking at the judge, but his expression wasn't angry. His eyes weren't filled with hate. If anything, he looked sad for the man sitting next to him. He looked like a teacher watching a student make a mistake that they would regret later. The contrast between the two men was striking. One was loud, shifting, desperate for attention. The other was still, solid, and quiet. The host tried again to steer the ship away from the rocks. Well, speaking of beautiful days, the host stammered, his voice cracking slightly. Let's talk about the new film. The action scenes are incredible. Action scenes, yes, the judge interrupted again. He couldn't help himself. He was on a roll now, and he wanted to prove he was the alpha in the room. You run, you jump, you shoot, that's easy, that's pretend. Real life is looking in the mirror and liking what you see. He turned his body fully toward Keanu, his voice dropping to a loud whisper that the microphones picked up perfectly. You can run from explosions on screen, Keanu, but you can't run from your own face. That's sadness. It's written all over you. It's exhausting just looking at it. A gasp went through the audience. It was a ripple of shock that moved from the front row to the back. This wasn't banter anymore. This wasn't roasting. This was a personal attack on a man who had come there to help sick children. The crew members standing behind the cameras stopped moving. The director in the control booth leaned forward, his hand hovering over the cut button, but he didn't press it. They were live. He couldn't cut. Keanu took a slow breath. He could feel the tension in his own chest, a tightness that he knew well. It was the feeling of grief trying to rise up, the feeling of wanting to protect the memories of those he had lost. The judge was talking about sadness as if it were a fashion choice. He didn't know that the sadness Keanu carried was the price of love. He didn't know that every smile Keanu managed was a victory against the dark. Keanu looked down at his hands for a moment. He saw the scars on his knuckles, the signs of a life lived. He thought about the children in the hospital. He thought about how they faced pain every day with a bravery that this man on the stage would never understand. He realized that getting angry or yelling back would only give the judge what he wanted. It would make the show dramatic. It would make it a spectacle. So Keanu did something unexpected. He didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't fight at all. He just stopped. He stopped being the polite guest. He stopped being the movie star. He decided to be a human being. He decided to use this moment not to defend himself, but to say something true. The air in the studio felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, but without a cloud in the sky. The buzzing of the lights seemed to fade away. The judge was still talking, still filling the air with noise, but he was starting to realize that the silence was pushing back. He was starting to realize that the audience wasn't on his side. His voice wavered just a little bit, a crack in his armor of arrogance. "I mean, am I right?" he asked the crowd, looking for an ally. "Tell me I'm right." Nobody answered. The silence was absolute. Keanu lifted his head. He didn't look at the camera. He looked straight at the judge. There was a softness in his gaze that was more powerful than any shout. The movement was slow, deliberate. He shifted his weight in the chair, turning slightly so he was fully facing the man who had mocked him. The audience leaned forward. Millions of people watching at home leaned forward. The host stopped tapping his papers. For the first time in the entire interview, the judge stopped talking. He sat there, his mouth slightly open, waiting. The tension in the room was stretched tight, like a rubber band ready to snap. Keanu didn't speak immediately. He let the silence sit there for a few more seconds. He wanted the judge to feel it. He wanted the judge to hear his own heartbeat in the quiet. Then, very softly, Keanu began to speak. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. In the absolute quiet of the studio, his words were going to land like stones in a still pond. He wasn't going to argue about his career. He wasn't going to talk about money. He was going to talk about life, and he was going to change everything. The silence in the studio was not just quiet, it was heavy. It pressed against the glass walls of the control booth and squeezed the air out of the audience. The host sat with his mouth half open, his eyes darting back and forth between Keanu and the judge. He could feel the panic rising in his chest like a tide. This was a live broadcast. You couldn't just edit out a moment like this. He needed to do something, anything, to fill the empty air. He needed to make the noise start again so they could pretend everything was normal. All right," the host said, his voice pitching up an octave, trying too hard to sound cheerful. He tapped his stack of index cards against the desk, a nervous rhythm. "We certainly have a difference of opinion here today. Mr. Vance, you always have a unique way of looking at things. A very direct way." He let out a short, breathy laugh that died in the air the moment it left his lips. No one joined in. The host quickly turned his chair toward Keanu, desperate to move the conversation to safer ground. "Keanu, let's pivot back to the charity work, the gala next week." "It's okay," Keanu said. The words were soft, but the microphone caught them clearly. The host stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Keanu, really looked at him, and saw something that made him pause. Keanu wasn't looking at the cue cards. He wasn't looking at the camera. He had raised one hand slightly, palm outward, in a gentle gesture that asked for patience. It wasn't a gesture of anger. It was a gesture of calm authority. Keanu shifted in his chair. The leather creaked softly in the silence. He turned away from the host and faced the judge directly. For the first time, the actor squared his shoulders. He didn't look like a movie star anymore. He didn't look like the guy who played action heroes. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side, and he was about to tell the story of the fire. The judge, sensing the shift in gravity, tried to hold onto his smirk. But his eyes were flickering now. He glanced at the audience, but the people in the front row were staring at him with hard eyes. He crossed his arms tighter over his chest, a defensive wall. "You asked about the face," Keanu began. His voice was low, smoother than the polished tones of the host, but it carried a weight that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You asked about the sadness." He paused. He wasn't gathering his thoughts. He was giving the judge time to realize what he had just said. He was giving the audience time to settle in. "I think there is a misunderstanding about what sadness is," Keanu continued. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "It isn't a brand. It isn't something I put on like a jacket before I walk out the door. It isn't for show." The studio lights reflected in Keanu's dark eyes, but there was a depth there that the lights couldn't reach. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. It was a posture of intimacy, as if he were speaking to one person, not millions. "When you love people," Keanu said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear, "and you lose them. The love doesn't just go away. It has nowhere to go. So it stays with you." The judge opened his mouth to interrupt, to crack a joke about it being Hollywood drama, but the sheer conviction in Keanu's voice stopped him. The words hung in the air, sharp and real. "We have this life," Keanu said, looking around the studio, taking in the bright lights and the fake set. "It is short. It can be incredibly hard. We lose people. Sometimes they are taken too soon. Sometimes they are sick. Sometimes they just leave." He paused again, and the sadness on his face was no longer a topic of debate. It was a visible, palpable thing. "And when that happens, you don't just get over it because you have money. You don't get over it because you are famous. The grief is the receipt for the love. It is the proof that you loved them and that they mattered." The audience was frozen. A young woman in the third row wiped a tear from her cheek, unnoticed. A camera operator standing in the shadows lowered his camera for a second, swallowing hard. This was not a script. This was not a performance. This was a human being stripping away the layers of celebrity nonsense and speaking the raw truth. Keanu turned his gaze back to the judge. The look was not accusatory. It was sad. It was the look you give a child who doesn't understand why a broken toy can't be fixed. "So, when you see me sitting here," Keanu said softly, "and you think I look sad, you are right. I am carrying the people I lost. I carry my daughter, I carry my partner, I carry my friends, and I carry them with honor, I carry them with love." The judge shifted in his seat. The arrogance was draining out of him, leaving him looking pale and small. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable anymore. It was sacred. It was a moment of collective mourning for everyone watching who had ever lost someone they loved. The host sat very still. He had forgotten all about the ratings. He had forgotten about the script. He was just a man listening to another man talk about pain. The air in the studio felt cooler now. Or perhaps it was just that the heat of the confrontation had been replaced by a chill of realization. The heavy wooden door to the control booth was closed, but inside, the director was watching the monitors with tears in his eyes, his hand hovering over the buttons, afraid to cut away. Keanu hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted the judge. He hadn't called him names. He had simply spoken the truth, and the truth was heavier than any insult. The truth was that life is fragile, and loss is permanent, and making fun of someone's pain is the mark of a person who hasn't yet learned what it means to truly be alive. The judge looked down at his hands, unable to meet Keanu's eyes any longer. The silence in the studio was complete, waiting for what would come next. Keanu sat there, his hands resting calmly on his knees, looking at the man who had tried to humiliate him. The air in the studio was so thick now that it felt hard to breathe. The previous noise, the buzzing of the lights, the shuffling of feet, all of it had vanished. There was only the sound of Keanu's voice, low and steady, cutting through the tension like a warm knife through butter. He hadn't finished yet. He had explained his pain, but now he wanted to explain why the judge's reaction mattered. "It isn't just about me," Keanu continued, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "When we see someone who is hurting, and our first instinct is to mock them or to make a joke of it, what does that say about us? It says we are afraid. It says we are uncomfortable with the reality that life is fragile." He paused, letting the thought hang in the air. The judge was no longer leaning back with his arms crossed. His posture had collapsed inward. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a stage expecting to read a comedy script, only to find out it was a tragedy. The smirk was completely gone, replaced by a pale, rigid expression. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, but there was nowhere to go. Millions of people were watching, and he was trapped in the spotlight of his own making. "We build these walls," Keanu said, gesturing slightly with one hand. "We use humor as a shield. We use cynicism to keep people at a distance. You called my sadness a brand, but maybe, just maybe, the sadness is just the truth. And maybe, instead of laughing at it, we should try to understand it. Because everyone in this room," he glanced at the audience, at the cameras, at the silent crew members, "everyone watching at home, we are all going to face it. We are all going to lose someone. And when that day comes for you, Mr. Vance, or for anyone else here, you aren't going to want someone to point a finger at you and laugh. You're going to want someone to sit with you in the quiet." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, but it was also clean. The toxicity had been purged from the room, replaced by a brutal, undeniable truth. The judge swallowed hard. His throat moved visibly, and for the first time he looked small. The expensive suit, the perfectly styled hair, the arrogant demeanor, it all looked like a costume now. A costume that had been ripped away to reveal a flawed, human man underneath. The host sat frozen. He looked at his monitor, then back at Keanu. He had never seen anything like this in all his years of television. Usually, when guests argued, they shouted over each other. They created clips that would go viral for the noise, but this was going to go viral for the quiet. It was going to go viral because Keanu Reeves had just schooled a bully without raising his voice, without using a single insult. He had used empathy as a weapon, and it had been devastatingly effective. Keanu looked at the judge one last time. There was no anger in his gaze. If anything, there was a hint of pity. He saw a man who had spent so long performing toughness that he had forgotten how to be kind. Keanu took a deep breath and softened his voice even more, turning the moment from a confrontation into a lesson. "I don't hold it against you," Keanu said gently. "I know you were trying to be entertaining. You were trying to get a laugh, but we have to be careful with our hearts. We have to be careful with other people's hearts, because we only get one life. It is short and it is precious, and if we spend it tearing each other down just to get a reaction, then we have wasted it." The judge opened his mouth. His lips trembled slightly. He wanted to say something smart. He wanted to revert to his character, the tough guy who takes no prisoners. But the words wouldn't come. How do you argue with kindness? How do you fight against someone who refuses to fight back? He felt a burning sensation in his chest, a hot flush of shame that started at his neck and moved up to his ears. He looked down at the polished table, seeing his own reflection staring back at him, and he didn't like what he saw. The judge's voice cracked. It was a dry, weak sound. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, trying to find that booming television voice, but it was gone. I didn't mean to," he trailed off. He couldn't finish the sentence. Because he had meant it. He had meant to be mean. He had meant to be funny at someone else's expense. And now, sitting in the silence of the studio, faced with the gentle dignity of the man he had tried to mock, the intention felt ugly. It felt small. Keanu didn't press him. He didn't demand an apology. He just nodded, a slow, understanding nod. He sat back in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders. He had said what he needed to say. He had defended the people he loved, and he had done it with grace. The host looked at the camera, his face pale. He realized that the interview was effectively over. There was no way to go back to talking about action movies or charity galas after that. The moment had eclipsed the show. The segment had become something else entirely, a masterclass on humanity. He glanced at the producer in the booth, who was standing with his mouth open, staring at the monitor. The audience was still silent. No one was checking their phones. No one was whispering to their neighbor. Hundreds of people were just sitting there, processing what they had just witnessed. They had come to be entertained, to see a movie star and a funny judge. Instead, they had seen a glimpse of the human soul. They had seen how easy it is to be cruel and how powerful it is to be kind. Keanu turned his head and looked at the host. His face was calm again, the sad intensity fading back into his usual quiet reserve. But the room had changed. The air felt different. The judge sat slumped in his chair, staring at his hands, defeated not by an argument, but by the truth. The commercial brake light hadn't flashed yet. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the stillness. It was the most gripping television the network had ever aired, and it was happening in absolute silence. The red light on the camera blinked off, signaling the commercial break. It was a small, mechanical click, but in the quiet of the studio, it sounded like a gunshot. The spell that had held the room in its grip didn't break right away. The silence stretched out, lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The host let out a long, shaky breath that he seemed to have been holding for minutes. He put his head in his hands for a moment, collecting himself, before looking up at the control booth. The judge sat motionless. He wasn't looking at the audience, and he wasn't looking at the cameras. He was staring at the polished black table in front of him, seeing his own reflection. The arrogant man who had walked onto the stage 20 minutes ago was gone. In his place sat a man who looked suddenly older. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the realization that had just hit him. He had tried to use cruelty as a tool for entertainment, and he had broken it against the wall of Keanu's quiet dignity. The judge started to say, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat, trying to find the booming voice he used in his courtroom, but it was nowhere to be found. I didn't mean to be. He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. Because the truth was, he had asterisk meant to be mean. He had meant to score points. But now, sitting in the aftermath, the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He looked up at Keanu, his eyes searching for anger, looking for a reason to defend himself. But Keanu wasn't looking at him with anger. Keanu was looking at him with a gentle patience. He reached out and placed a hand on the judge's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, a light touch through the fabric of the expensive suit, but it was heavy with meaning. It was forgiveness before an apology was even fully formed. It's all right, Keanu said softly. We all have days where we say the wrong thing. We just have to try to do better next time. The producer's voice crackled through the studio speakers, breaking the intimacy of the moment. We're back in 60 seconds, people. Let's reset. The activity in the studio started up again, but it was different now. The crew moved with a new kind of respect. The makeup artist rushed in to powder the men's faces, but she touched Keanu's arm with a tenderness that wasn't there before. She didn't look at the judge at all. The host adjusted his jacket, took a sip of water, and turned to Keanu. Thank you, the host whispered, his eyes sincere. Thank you for saying that. Keanu just nodded. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to move the conversation forward. When the red light flickered back on, signaling they were live to the world, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The host sat up straighter, but his smile was gone, replaced by a look of serious thoughtfulness. He didn't try to crack a joke. He didn't try to pretend the last few minutes hadn't happened. We are back with Keanu Reeves and Judge Vance, the host said into the microphone, and I think we need to take a moment to appreciate what was just said. He turned to the audience. We talk a lot about entertainment. We talk a lot about movies and courtroom drama, but sometimes real life reminds us what is actually important. The judge looked at the camera. For a moment, the old mask slipped back on, the professional TV persona, but it was cracked. He took a deep breath. I want to apologize, he said, his voice steady but humble. To Keanu and to anyone I offended, I spoke too quickly. I judged a book by its cover, and I was wrong. Mr. Reeves, you have my respect. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It was simple and direct. The audience applauded. It wasn't the wild, cheering applause of a game show. It was a slow, rhythmic clapping, a sound of acknowledgement and acceptance. Keanu nodded his head again. Thank you, he said. Apologies are hard. It takes courage to change your mind in front of millions of people. That matters, too. With the tension resolved, the show began to wind down. But they didn't go back to the script. They didn't talk about the latest action movie. Instead, they finished the interview talking about the children's hospital. Keanu's face lit up when he talked about the kids, the sadness lifting just enough to let a warm, genuine smile shine through. He spoke about the courage of the parents, the resilience of the sick children, and how helping others was the best way to heal your own heart. Even the judge joined in, asking thoughtful questions, listening intently. The dynamic had shifted from predator and prey to two human beings having a real conversation. "And that is all the time we have for today," the host said after a few minutes. The show ended not with a loud jingle, but with a wide shot of the three men sitting on the stage. As the credits rolled and the cameras pulled back, Keanu stood up. He didn't rush away. He buttoned his jacket and turned to the judge. He extended his hand. The judge stood up and took it. They shook hands. It wasn't a quick hand for the camera shake. It was a firm, two-handed grip. They looked each other in the eye. In that handshake, there was an understanding. The judge had learned a lesson he would never forget, and Keanu had taught it without cruelty. Keanu turned and walked toward the side of the stage. As he moved, the audience stood up. This time, the applause was loud. It was a wave of appreciation that washed over the studio. It wasn't just for the actor, it was for the man. People were clapping because he had reminded them how to be human. He had reminded them that kindness is stronger than mockery. Keanu walked off the stage and into the wings. The moment he was out of the spotlight, his shoulders relaxed. He didn't look for a producer or a manager. He walked over to the young intern who was holding a bottle of water for him. He took the water, said thank you, and asked her if she was having a good day. He listened to her answer, really listened, just as he had listened to the pain in the room earlier. Back on the set, the judge was still standing there. He watched Keanu walk away. He stood there for a long time, looking at the empty chair where the sad man had sat. The studio lights were beginning to dim, the buzz of the crowd fading as people filed out of the exits. The judge stood alone in the fading light, realizing that while he had come there to judge someone else, he was the one who had been judged and found wanting. But he had also been forgiven. As the studio emptied out, a quiet peace settled over the set. The harsh lights were turned off one by one, plunging the room into shadows, but the feeling remained. It was the feeling that sometimes, in the middle of all the noise and the fake television glitter, something real happens, something that changes people. And as the janitor began to sweep the floor, picking up the discarded water bottles and the dusty footprints, the air still seemed to vibrate with the echo of Keanu's voice, reminding anyone who was listening that we are all just carrying something, and the best thing we can do is help each other carry it.